The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. Swelter leaves his card. The winds of the drear interim that lies between the last of autumn and the first of winter had torn the few remaining leaves from even the most sheltered of the branches that swung in the twisted woods. Elsewhere the trees had been skeletons for many weeks. The melancholy of decay had given place to a less mournful humour. In dying, the chill season had ceased to weep, and arising from its pyre of coloured leaves had cried out with such a voice as had no hint of tears, and something fierce began to move the air and pace across the tracts of Gormenghast. From the death of the sap, of the bird-song, of the sun, this other life in death arose to fill the vacuum of nature. The wine was yet in the wind, the November wine. But as night followed night, its long trailing note became less and less a part of the mounting music which among the battlements was by now an almost nightly background to those who slept or tried to sleep in the castle of the Groans. More and more in the darkness the notes of grimmer passions could be discerned. Hatred and anger and pain, and the hounding voices of vengeance. One evening, several weeks after the burning, at about an hour before midnight, Flay lowered himself to the ground outside Lord Sepulchre's bedroom door. Inured though he was to the cold floorboards, for they had been his only bed for many years, yet on this November evening they struck a chill into his flinty bones, and his shanks began to ache. The wind whistled and screamed about the castle, and gelid draughts skidded along the landing, and Flay heard the sound of doors opening and shutting at varying distances from him. He was able to follow the course of a draught as it approached from the northern fastness of the castle, for he recognized the sound that was peculiar to each distant door as it creaked and slammed, the noises becoming louder and louder until heavy mildewy curtains, which hung at the end of the passage 40 feet away, lifted and muttered, and the door which lay immediately beyond them grated and strained at its only hinge. And Flay knew that the icy spearhead of a fresh draught was close upon him. "Getting old," he muttered to himself, rubbing his thighs and folding himself up like a stick insect at the foot of the door. He had slept soundly enough last winter when the snow had lain deeply over Gormenghast. He remembered with distaste how it had coated the windows, clinging to the panes, and how, when the sun sank over the mountains, the snow had appeared to bulge inwards through the window panes in a lather of blood. This memory disturbed him, and he dimly knew that the reason why the cold was affecting him more and more during these desolate nights had nothing to do with his age, for his body was hardened to the point of being more like some inanimate substance than flesh and blood. It was true that it was a particularly bad night, rough and loud, but he remembered that 4 nights ago there had been no wind, and yet he had shivered as he was shivering now. "Getting old," he muttered grittily to himself again between his long discoloured teeth, but he knew that he lied. No cold on earth could make his hair stand up like tiny wires, stiffly, almost painfully, along his thighs and forearms and at the nape of his neck. Was he afraid? Yes, as any reasonable man would be. He was very afraid, although the sensation was rather different in him from that which would have been experienced in other men. He was not afraid of the darkness, of the opening and shutting of distant doors, of the screaming wind. He had lived all his life in a forbidding, half-lit world. He turned over so as to command a view of the stairhead, although it was almost too dark to see it. He cracked the 5 knuckles of his left hand, one by one. But he could hardly hear the reports, for a new wave of the gale rattled every window, and the darkness was alive with the slamming of doors. He was afraid. He had been afraid for weeks. But Flay was not a coward. There was something tenacious and hard in his centre, something obstinate which precluded panic. All of a sudden, the gale seemed to hurl itself to a climax, and then to cease utterly. But the interim of dead silence was over as soon as it had started, for a few seconds later, as though from a different quarter, the storm unleashed another of its armies of solid rain and hail, pouring its broadsides against the castle from the belly of a yet more riotous tempest. During the few moments of what seemed to be an absolute silence between the two storms, Flay had jerked his body forward from the ground, and had sat bolt upright, every muscle frozen. He had forced a knuckle between his teeth to stop them from chattering, and with his eyes focused upon the dark stairhead, he had heard, quite plainly, a sound that was both near and far away, a sound hideously distinct. In that lacuna of stillness, the stray sounds of the castle had become wayward, ungageable. A mouse nibbling beneath floorboards might equally have been within a few feet or several halls away. The sound that Flay heard was of a knife being deliberately whetted. How far away he had no means of telling. It was a sound in vacuo, an abstract thing, yet so enormously it sounded, it might well have been within an inch of his craning ear. The number of times the blade moved across the hone had no relation to the actual length of time which Flay experienced as he listened. To him, the mechanical forward and backward movement of steel against stone lasted the night itself. Had the dawn broken as he listened, he would not have been surprised. In reality, it was but a few moments, and when the second tempest flung itself roaring against the castle walls, Flay was on his hands and knees with his head thrust forward towards the sound, his lips drawn back from his teeth. For the rest of the night the storm was unabated. He crouched there at his master's door hour after hour, but he heard no more of that hideous scraping. The dawn, when it came, powdering with slow and inexorable purpose the earthy blackness with grey seeds, found the servant open-eyed, his hands hanging like dead weights over his drawn-up knees, his defiant chin between his wrists. Slowly the air cleared, and stretching his cramped limbs one by one, he reared up stiffly to his feet, shrugging his shoulders to his ears. Then he took the iron key from between his teeth and dropped it into his jacket pocket. In 7 slow paces he had reached the stairhead and was staring down into a well of cold. The stairs descended as though forever. As his eyes moved from step to step, they noticed a small object in the centre of one of the landings, about 40 feet below. It was in the shape of a rough oval. Flay turned his head to Lord Sepulchreve's door. The sky was drained of its fury, and there was silence. He descended, his hand on the banisters. Each step awoke echoes from below him, and fainter echoes from above him, away to the east. As he reached the landing, a ray of light ran like a slender spear through an eastern window, and quivered in a little patch on the wall, a few feet from where he stood. This thread of light intensified the shadows below and above it, and it was only after some groping that Flay came across the object. In his harsh hands it felt disgustingly soft. He brought it close to his eyes and became aware of a sickly, penetrating smell. But he could not see what it was that he held. Then, lifting it into the sunbeams so that his hand cast a shadow over the lozenge of light upon the wall, he saw, as though it was something supernaturally illuminated, a very small, richly and exquisitely sculpted gatto. At the perimeter of this delicacy, a frail, coral-like substance had been worked into the links of a chain, leaving in the centre a minute arena of jade-green icing, across whose glassed surface the letter S lay coiled like a worm of cream.